The night was thick with salt and smoke over Tokyo Bay. In the dim barracks lit by a single hanging bulb, the air felt heavy, half defeat, half disbelief. A young Japanese nurse sat on the edge of a wooden cot, her uniform torn, her palms grey with dust. Outside, boots crunched over gravel, foreign voices echoing in clipped English. Then came the knock. 3 soft raps that made her spine lock straight. The war was over, but for her, something else had just begun. The door creaked open. 2 American soldiers stood there, silhouettes backlit by the floodlight. One of them spoke slowly, almost uncertain. "You, come with us." His accent carved through the silence like a blade. Her throat went dry. She'd heard rumors, POWs taken, questioned, sometimes vanished. As she rose, the barrack's stale air pressed against her chest. Every step toward that door felt like crossing a line between 2 worlds. The empire she'd served and the unknown that waited beyond it. Tokyo Bay was quiet that August night in 1945, but the silence screamed louder than the bombs that had stopped just days ago. Japan had surrendered. The empire of the rising sun had fallen to its knees. More than 6 million Japanese soldiers, nurses and sailors were scattered across islands, camps and ruins. And yet, in this small corner of a captured base, history narrowed to one woman being led down a hallway by men who didn't look at her with hate. Just curiosity. Inside the corridor, fluorescent lights flickered, a faint smell of whiskey and oil mixed with wet canvas. She caught fragments of English words. Officer's orders. Private room. Keep it quiet. The last phrase made her heart pound. What did they want from her? To interrogate her, to humiliate her. Her training had warned her, never show fear to the enemy, but fear was already winning. When they stopped before a wooden door marked Command Quarters, one soldier turned to her, his face unreadable. He said something she didn't understand, but the tone, soft, almost apologetic, confused her. Then the latch clicked. The door opened. A room glowed faintly inside, warmer than the hallway. Maps on the wall, a folded American flag on the desk. She stepped in, and for the first time heard the language of her enemy echo like a strange kind of peace. The door shut behind her with a dull click, sealing out the hallway's noise. Inside, the air was different, cooler, laced with the scent of tobacco and polished wood. A single lamp cast long shadows across a desk cluttered with maps, a compass, and a half-empty bottle of whiskey. The hum of a distant generator filled the silence. The young nurse froze, eyes fixed on the folded American flag sitting neatly on the corner of the desk, its edges precise, its meaning foreign. Across the room, a man looked up. He wasn't what she expected. No medals gleamed on his chest, no hardened glare of victory. He was young, barely 25 by her guess. His sleeves rolled, his collar open, fatigue settling into his shoulders. His gaze was steady but not unkind. He gestured for her to sit. No guards stood by the door, no chains, just space, strange and unguarded. She hesitated, unsure if it was a trick. Back home, officers didn't invite women to sit. They commanded. Here, even the enemy seemed to question his own authority. "You are nurse?" he asked in broken Japanese, his accent thick but his tone careful. She nodded. The word felt dangerous, but also like armor. Across the Pacific, hundreds of thousands of Japanese prisoners were being catalogued, moved, interrogated. Reports would later estimate more than 400,000 taken by Allied forces before war's end. But this moment wasn't about numbers or orders. It was about 2 people caught between the same silence. The victor unsure how to act human, the defeated unsure if she was still one. Her eyes darted to the whiskey bottle, the flickering lamp, the uneven stacks of papers on the desk. Maps of Japan sprawled open, red pins marking places she once called home. One pin rested over Nagasaki. Her chest tightened. He noticed her gaze. "You from there?" he asked. She shook her head quickly. "Tokyo," she whispered. The officer nodded once, as if to say, "You made it farther than most." Then he stood, pacing briefly, hands behind his back. "War finish," he said. She understood enough. Finish. The word sounded heavier than any explosion. He stopped by the desk, met her eyes again, and said softly, "Sit, please." please." For the first time since the surrender, she felt less like a prisoner and more like a question waiting to be answered. He leaned forward, elbows resting on the desk, eyes scanning her face as if reading a secret. The lamp flickered, catching the faint tremor in her hands. Outside, the night buzzed with insects and the distant cough of engines winding down. Inside, the air felt still, tense, but not hostile. The American officer spoke again, this time slower, trying to bridge the gap between their languages. "Name?" he asked, tapping his pen on a sheet of paper yellowed with sweat stains. She swallowed hard. "Satohana," she whispered. He repeated it softly. "Satohana." Each syllable clumsy but careful, as though afraid to break it. Then he wrote it down, his handwriting neat but pressed too hard, the letters carving into the page. She noticed his hands. Young hands, unscarred, nails clean. He couldn't have fought long. Maybe he'd only arrived after the surrender, when the dying stopped, but the counting began. Reports later revealed that nearly 1 in 4 Allied troops serving in the Pacific were under 26. Boys made into officers by attrition, not ambition. He looked like one of them. Tired. Too old for his age. Their eyes met again. For a second she saw something she hadn't seen since before the air raids. Hesitation. Not pity, not authority. Just a flicker of doubt. He asked about her unit, his Japanese broken but sincere. "Hospital. Where?" She hesitated, unsure how much truth was safe. "Okinawa," she said finally. He frowned, perhaps remembering the chaos that name carried. He scribbled something in his notes, then looked up again. "You hurt?" She shook her head. He studied her, trying to decide whether to believe her. Then he sighed, leaned back, and reached for a tin cup beside the whiskey bottle. The metal clinked lightly as he poured something dark into it. Not whiskey, but coffee. He slid it across the desk toward her. Steam rose between them, curling in the stale air. She hesitated, the smell foreign and rich. He gave a faint smile, the kind people use to calm animals, not enemies. "Drink," he said. The cup trembled slightly as she lifted it, the heat seeping into her cold fingers. She took one cautious sip, and the bitterness shocked her tongue. Sharp and alive. The war had ended days ago, but this first taste of coffee would linger longer than the taste of defeat. The first sip burned her tongue, but she didn't flinch. The taste, bitter, smoky, almost metallic, spread through her like a memory she didn't own. It wasn't tea, it wasn't rice water, it was something else entirely. Across the table, the officer watched her reaction, his expression unreadable. For him, this was ordinary. For her, it was like tasting another world. Outside, rain tapped lightly against the tin roof. The room smelled of damp uniforms, tobacco, and that alien drink, coffee. She took another sip, slower this time. The warmth traveled down her throat, cutting through the numbness that had clung to her since surrender. For a second, she forgot where she was. The American soldiers drank this every day. Reports from the Pacific showed that by 1945, the US military imported more than 280 million pounds of coffee for its troops, enough to fill entire ships. Meanwhile, in Japan, her hospital had survived on boiled roots and seaweed broth. Food had become memory, hunger, routine. The officer reached into a small crate beside him and pulled out another tin, milk powder. He poured a bit into her cup, stirred it with the back of his spoon. The swirl of pale colour looked almost beautiful in the dim light. "Better?" he asked. She didn't understand the word, but his tone told her. She nodded, murmuring, "Hi." He smiled faintly, then leaned back, eyes tracing the rain streaks on the window. "You nurse?" "Long time?" he asked. She hesitated, then answered in fragments. "Since 1941. Field hospital. South." He nodded, his jaw tightening. That was the year America entered the war. They'd been enemies ever since she first wore that uniform. But here they were. Two survivors sharing a drink, neither could explain. She noticed how he handled the tin cup. Steady, deliberate, almost reverent. War had stripped them both of ceremony, but this small act, offering warmth, felt like a quiet rebellion against everything they'd been taught. When she looked at him again, she caught a glimpse of something she hadn't expected. Not pity, recognition. He wasn't here to punish her. He was trying to understand her. The coffee's bitterness lingered, like a promise she didn't yet trust. He set the empty cup aside, eyes softening. "Tell me," he said gently, "your home, where?" And with that question, the conversation shifted from duty to something dangerously human. She hesitated before answering his question. Home? It felt like a word from another lifetime. Her tongue tightened. "Tokyo," she said softly. "No more house." The officer's pen froze mid-scribble. He didn't ask what happened. He didn't need to. Everyone knew Tokyo had burned. For a long moment, neither spoke. The rain had stopped, replaced by the low hum of distant trucks outside. Somewhere someone laughed, an American voice, sharp and careless. It cut through the silence like a reminder that she was still on the losing side. The officer cleared his throat, trying to shift the air. "You hungry?" he asked, his words halting, uncertain. She blinked, unsure if she'd heard right. Hungry? Not traitor, not enemy, but hungry. The question felt heavier than an order. In her army, mercy wasn't language, it was weakness. Back in the hospital, she'd watched wounded men die whispering prayers that food might come. By the end of 1945, starvation had claimed nearly 2 million Japanese civilians. Even officers rationed salt like treasure. And now, here, the enemy was offering her food. He reached into a wooden crate and pulled out a small tin can. She recognized the words stamped on the side in English letters. Peaches. He opened it with a practiced motion, the lid snapping open to reveal soft, golden slices floating in syrup. The smell hit her. Sweet. Impossible. He placed the can in front of her along with a small metal spoon. She didn't move. "Eat," he said gently. When she didn't respond, he added, "It's okay." Her hand trembled as she lifted the spoon. The syrup dripped slowly, catching the lamplight before landing back in the tin. She took one bite. The sugar shocked her system like electricity. Tears blurred her vision before she could stop them. The officer pretended not to notice, turning his eyes to the map on the wall. She swallowed hard, then whispered something she hadn't said aloud in months. "Arigato." The word hung between them, fragile, dangerous, real. He nodded slightly. No reply, no smile. Just understanding. For the first time since her capture, she realized that mercy didn't have to sound like surrender. Sometimes it tasted like fruit. He leaned back slowly, eyes distant, as if questioning his own orders. The moment lingered, soft, human, unfinished. Then, without a word, he reached for another box. The tin can glimmered faintly under the desk lamp. Each bite felt like a sin, like tasting something forbidden. She chewed slowly, the sweetness coating her tongue until it almost hurt. Her stomach cramped, unsure whether to accept the sudden kindness or reject it. Across the table, the officer said nothing. He just watched, elbows resting on his knees, as though the act of feeding an enemy was something he needed to understand, not explain. She'd treated wounded men in tents made of torn canvas, where the only food was rice mixed with gravel. The taste of fruit, real fruit, had become myth. Yet here, her captor handed her a can of abundance. Reports would later show that the US shipped over 17 million tons of food aid across war-torn regions after the fighting stopped. She couldn't know those numbers, but she could feel them in the weight of the spoon, in the warmth of the room, in the look of quiet conflict on his face. The syrup dripped down her fingers, sticky and warm. She froze, unsure whether to lick it clean. He noticed, reached across the desk, and handed her a napkin. That simple motion, a scrap of paper passed between enemies, felt louder than the surrender broadcast that had ended the war. "Good?" he asked softly. She met his eyes, nodded once. "Good," she echoed, her accent bending the word into something new. He smiled, almost boyishly, before glancing at the tin again. For him, this was standard ration food, the kind packed into crates by the thousands. For her, it was a taste of everything lost: luxury, peace, safety. When she finished, she set the spoon carefully back into the can, as if returning an offering. Her eyes dropped to the table. She whispered, "We had nothing left, only duty." He didn't answer, but his expression shifted, as if the word duty meant something heavier now. The air between them changed. Less interrogation, more conversation. He leaned back, exhaling slowly, the lamplight catching the weariness on his face. "You did what you were told," he murmured, not as a question but as truth. She nodded. We both did. Outside, thunder rolled faintly, miles away. Inside, silence turned sacred. He reached into his pocket, pulled out a cigarette, and held it toward her. The cigarette trembled slightly between his fingers as he held it out. She stared at it, unsure whether this was a test or a gesture. In her world, smoking was for men, officers, soldiers, victors. She shook her head softly, bowing a little. The officer nodded, not offended, and lit his own instead. The match flared, briefly illuminating the sharp lines of his jaw before dissolving into darkness. He exhaled slowly, the smoke curling like ghosts between them. The faint scent mixed with whiskey and rain. For a moment the war didn't exist. There was only this. Two people sitting in a small wooden room, pretending they weren't supposed to hate each other. Why? You stay? He asked finally, his tone cautious. She tilted her head. Stay? He gestured vaguely, toward the door, the base, the world beyond. War finish. Others run. You stay, her eyes lowered. My unit gone, she said. Hospital bombed. The words came out flat, practiced. No place to run, he nodded, cigarette between his fingers. You could hide. I did, she whispered. Then you came. The officer fell quiet. The ember glowed between his fingertips, burning shorter with each breath. He looked like he wanted to ask more but couldn't find the words. Maybe it wasn't language. Maybe it was conscience. Nearly 70% of American soldiers smoked during the war. It was habit, comfort, ritual. But here, in this strange moment, it felt like confession. The smoke drifted around them like memory. Of bodies, of cities, of everything they'd both lost in different ways. She broke the silence first. Why you here? She asked suddenly. He looked at her surprised. Orders, he said after a pause. Always orders. He tapped the cigarette on the ashtray, the motion sharp, controlled. Same as you, right? She gave a faint, almost invisible smile. Yes, same. For the first time, they weren't captor and captive. They were mirror and reflection. The realization made the air feel heavier, charged with something unnamed. He stood, walking toward the window. Outside, the base lights flickered in the mist. Tomorrow, he said quietly. Maybe you go somewhere safe. Her heart thudded. Safe? She echoed, tasting the word like the coffee earlier. Bitter, uncertain, but human. He turned back toward her, his eyes softer now. I'll see what I can do. And just like that, the walls around her began to crack. For the first time, he asked her to tell her story. Not as an officer, not as an enemy, just as a person who wanted to understand. She hesitated, staring at the cigarette smoke twisting above his desk like a slow-moving storm. Her voice came out thin, barely audible. We were in Okinawa, she began. The officer straightened slightly. Even the name carried weight. Okinawa, where the earth itself had turned against them. She continued, eyes unfocused, words trembling. Hospital tents near the cliffs. April 1945. Bombs came every hour. We buried men in rain. He didn't interrupt. He just listened, jaw tight. The stories had traveled through every soldier in the Pacific. How that single island had devoured more than 200,000 lives, most of them civilians. She had been there, inside that chaos, stitching wounds until the scalpels dulled, wrapping limbs in bedsheets when bandages ran out. She described the night her unit fell apart. The sky on fire, the waves red. The last order she received from her superior officer. Do not surrender. She whispered those words now, almost ashamed. We were told surrender is sin, better to die. He closed his eyes for a moment. But you didn't, he said quietly. She shook her head. No, I found wounded. Too many. Could not leave. Her memories came in flashes. Shell fire, screams, the smell of iodine mixed with blood. She remembered crawling through mud to pull a young soldier from beneath debris, only to realize he was already gone. She remembered the last time she saw her commanding nurse, standing at the edge of a cliff, hair whipping in the wind, choosing death over capture. She jumped, Hannah said flatly. I wanted to too, but my hands, they kept moving. The officer's cigarette burned out. He didn't light another. For a moment, neither spoke. The only sound was rain starting again, light, steady, like distant applause. Then he said softly, You saved lives. That's not sin. She looked at him, eyes hollow but alive. In Japan, obedience is life. He nodded slowly, understanding something wordless. And here, he said, sometimes mercy is. Outside, thunder murmured low. Inside, both of them sat in silence, trapped between two definitions of honor. He leaned back, exhaling. The war had ended, but their beliefs hadn't. The rain eased into a whisper, tracing faint trails down the glass. Neither of them spoke for a while. The silence was heavy, but not empty. It carried the weight of everything unsaid. The officer sat back, rubbing his temple, the lamplight outlining the deep shadows under his eyes. Okinawa, he murmured finally, more to himself than to her. We all lost something there. She studied his face, young but carved by exhaustion. Maybe he'd never been on the island, but the ghosts had followed him anyway. His uniform looked clean, but his eyes didn't. The kind of eyes that had seen more surrender than victory. He picked up a pencil and began drawing absent lines across a map. Tokyo, Osaka, Nagasaki, red ink bleeding into paper. We thought we understood war, he said. We didn't. For a moment she almost pitied him. Almost. Because he had food, warmth, command, and she had nothing. Yet looking at him, she realized he wasn't free either. He was trapped in another kind of cage, the one built from guilt. Your people fight different, she said quietly. Die for emperor. No choice, he nodded slowly. Our orders say, live for freedom. But no one tells us what that means. They looked at each other then. Two soldiers of opposite flags, both shaped by commands from men they'd never meet. Estimates from that time would show nearly 100 million people served in uniform during the global war. Each obeying voices carried through radios and propaganda posters, none ever speaking to the ones who decided. The officer stood, restless, pacing behind the desk. He stopped near his holster, hand hovering above it, then slowly unclipped the strap. The movement made her flinch. But then something unexpected. He removed the pistol, placed it gently on the table. The metallic clink echoed through the room. Her heart raced. Disarmed, not her, but him. I'm tired, he said quietly. Of orders, of this. For a second she didn't understand. Then, realization struck. He wasn't threatening her. He was surrendering, in his own way. She stared at the weapon glinting on the desk. The ultimate symbol of power, now turned harmless. The war had ended outside, but maybe, in this room, it was ending again, in smaller, quieter ways. He met her eyes. You can sleep here tonight, he said softly. And that single sentence broke every rule she'd ever been taught about enemies. The pistol sat between them like a secret neither could name. Its barrel caught the lamplight, dull and unthreatening now. The officer's hand lingered on the desk for a second, then pulled away. No words, just the slow exhale of someone letting go of everything drilled into him. She didn't move, eyes locked on the weapon that had ended so many lives. Yet here, it had just preserved one. Her breath trembled. In her training, a soldier's gun was never set down unless the fight was over. Maybe this was his way of saying that it finally was. Outside, the rain thinned into mist, drumming softly on tin roofs. The air smelled of wet dust and oil. He sank into the chair, elbows on his knees, face buried in his hands. For the first time he looked smaller. Not like an officer, not like a victor. Just a man stripped of mission. War's done, he murmured, mostly to himself. We keep acting like it's not. She said nothing. The silence between them was almost fragile, like glass. Too sharp to touch, too precious to break. He lifted his head again, his eyes bloodshot from exhaustion. You can sleep here tonight, he repeated quietly. The words echoed longer than they should have. He gestured toward a small cot pushed against the far wall. A thin wool blanket lay folded neatly on it. It's dry, safe, he added, fumbling for words. She hesitated. Enemy kindness was always dangerous, but she was too tired to argue with safety. She stood slowly, moved toward the cot, each step deliberate. Her body ached from days without real rest. The blanket felt heavy, coarse, and yet it was warmth. She sat, her back straight, eyes on him as if waiting for the command that never came. Across the desk, the officer leaned back, cigarette smoke curling through the air again. He stared at the pistol, then out the window. where the faint glow of campfires flickered across the mist. "They'll move you in the morning," he said softly. "Somewhere better." She nodded, though she didn't believe in better anymore. He turned off the lamp. The room dimmed, shadows melting into quiet. For the first time in months, she closed her eyes without fear of footsteps in the dark. But when the footsteps came, they arrived anyway, soft, deliberate, and just past midnight. The night pressed against the walls like a living thing, humid, restless, alive with the quiet sounds of soldiers who didn't yet know what peace meant. Hannah lay still on the cot, the rough wool scratching her skin, her body heavy, but her mind wide awake. Every creak of wood made her heart twitch. Outside, engines hummed, boots scuffed on gravel, and somewhere a generator coughed itself back to life. She turned toward the window. The moon hung low, silver on the horizon, slicing through the fog that rolled over Tokyo Bay. The war was over, they said, but no one told her what came after over. She'd seen surrenders, deaths, collapses, but not endings. Those belonged to stories, not survivors. She thought of the officer, his voice, his eyes, the way he'd placed his gun on the desk like a confession. He hadn't locked the door. Maybe he trusted her not to run. Maybe he didn't care if she did. Trust and apathy had started to look the same in this new kind of world. Hours passed. She must have drifted for a moment, because when she opened her eyes again, the air had changed. The room was darker, quieter, except for faint footsteps approaching down the corridor. Not rushed, not panicked, just steady. Her breath hitched. She sat up, listening. The steps stopped outside her door. A pause, then a knock. Once, twice. The handle turned and the door creaked open. The officer stepped inside, shadows slicing across his face. His cap was gone, his sleeves rolled up. He looked different, less like command, more like confession. "I didn't mean to wake you," he said softly. She shook her head, clutching the blanket tighter. "Couldn't sleep anyway," she replied, the words awkward in her mouth. He nodded, stepping closer, stopping near the desk. For a long moment, neither spoke. The air between them was thick, uncertain. Somewhere in the distance, gunfire popped. A final echo from soldiers who hadn't yet heard the word peace. It faded slowly, swallowed by the rain. "Peace takes time," he said quietly, almost reading her thoughts. "Sometimes it never comes." She studied his face in the moonlight, tracing the fatigue etched deep into his skin. "Then why fight?" she whispered. He looked down, thumb brushing the edge of the desk. "Because someone told us to." The same answer she'd given hours earlier, and somehow that made them equals. He didn't sit this time. He leaned against the edge of the desk, the wood creaking beneath his weight, eyes lost somewhere in the shadows. The clock on the wall ticked faintly, steady, slow, the sound of time that refused to stop for anyone. Hannah sat on the cot, blanket gathered around her knees, waiting. The air was thick with smoke and silence. "I had a sister," he said finally. His voice was lower now, roughened by something she couldn't name. "Back home, she wrote me letters every month." He stared at his hands, the light catching the veins along his knuckles. "Last one came in August. Said she was working in a factory. Never wrote again." Hannah didn't know what to say. Loss was a language she understood too well. "Where?" she asked softly. "Portland," he said. "Oregon." The word sounded foreign to her, like the name of a dream. For a long moment, they just listened to the hum of rain on the roof. Then he looked up, meeting her eyes. "You?" he asked. "Family." Her breath caught. The question felt like a knife she'd been avoiding. "Mother," she whispered. "Hiroshima." The silence turned heavier, almost unbearable. He closed his eyes. "I'm sorry," he said quietly. No translator needed. She understood. In that instant, the war collapsed. Not in surrender papers or speeches, but in the quiet apology of a man who carried guilt he didn't earn. Reports would later say more than 140,000 people were killed instantly in Hiroshima. To her, that number wasn't history. It was a face she'd never see again. He took a slow breath. "They told us it would end the war," he said. "They never said it would follow us home." Her eyes filled before she could stop them. Tears she'd refused for months finally broke free, tracing thin lines down her dirt-streaked cheeks. He didn't move closer. He just stood there, letting her cry, the rain outside echoing every sound she couldn't make. When she looked up again, the room seemed different, softer, smaller, more human. The map, the gun, the flag, all just objects now. Outside, thunder rolled gently across the bay. She whispered, "I don't hate you." He gave a faint, broken smile. "That makes one of us," he said quietly. And in that fragile confession, the war between them finally began to end. The rain had stopped. Only the steady ticking of the wall clock filled the room now, carving the silence into measured beats. Hannah sat motionless, her fingers gripping the edge of the blanket. The words, "I don't hate you," still hanging between them like smoke that refused to fade. The officer didn't reply. He just nodded once, the kind of nod people give when they hear something they can't return. He turned toward the desk, picking up his notebook, a worn leather cover, corners frayed, its pages swollen from humidity and time. He flipped it open halfway, the paper yellowed and crowded with rough sketches, coordinates, ration lists, fragments of thought. Hannah's eyes caught a faint drawing, just a silhouette of a mountain and a single kanji character. Peace. He must have copied it from a sign somewhere, not knowing its full meaning. Slowly, she reached up to her collar and unpinned her nurse's badge. The tiny emblem had been with her since 1941, through field hospitals, bomb shelters, and ruins. She turned it over once in her hand, tracing the faint scratches along the metal. It was her identity, her duty, her past. Without a word, she stood and crossed the room. Her bare feet barely made a sound on the wooden floor. She placed the badge on the desk in front of him, next to the notebook. The soft metallic tap sounded louder than the distant thunder outside. He looked up, startled. "What? Why?" "It's over," she said quietly. "I don't need this anymore." He stared at the small badge for a long moment, as if it carried more weight than a weapon. Then, wordlessly, he picked it up and turned it in his fingers, the lamplight catching the edges. "I'll keep it," he said finally. She nodded, her face calm but her eyes wet again. "Then remember." More than 35,000 Japanese women had served as nurses during the war. Most were forgotten, their stories buried under rubble and silence. But this one, this single exchange, turned survival into memory. He opened his notebook, placed the badge inside, and closed it carefully. The leather creaked softly. When their eyes met again, there was no rank, no nation, just two people who'd run out of enemies. Outside, dawn began to bleed faintly across the horizon. He glanced toward the window. "You'll leave in the morning," he said. "We'll make sure you're safe." The first light slipped through the blinds, thin and hesitant, turning the smoke in the air into slow-moving gold. Dawn in a war camp never truly felt peaceful, just quieter, like the world was holding its breath. Hannah sat by the window, watching the fog rise over the distant shoreline. The officer stood near the desk, his jacket folded neatly beside him, hair still damp from washing. Neither of them spoke. The night had taken too much from their words. He finally broke the silence. "A transport comes at noon," he said. "You'll be moved to Yokohama. Safer there." His voice carried something new, certainty mixed with guilt. She nodded. "Safe," she repeated, the words soft, unfamiliar. He reached for a wool blanket and handed it to her. "It's cold on the trucks," he added. She accepted it with both hands, bowing slightly out of habit. The gesture made him uncomfortable, almost ashamed. "You don't have to do that," he said quickly. "In my country," she replied, "we bow to those who show mercy." That single sentence froze him in place. He turned away, pretending to check the papers on his desk. The folded flag still sat there, motionless and heavy with meaning. Outside, the camp was waking up. Soldiers shouted orders, engines coughed to life. Somewhere, a kettle whistled. The routine of occupation resumed, efficient, relentless. But inside this small room, something had shifted. No orders, no scripts, just the quiet understanding that mercy could be disobedience too. By 1947, more than 1 million Japanese civilians would be repatriated by American ships. Names reduced to numbers, faces blurred in the fog of history. But at that moment, Hannah wasn't a number. She was the living proof of something fragile that had survived the machinery of war. Compassion without condition. She stood, clutching the blanket close. "And you?" she asked softly. "You go home soon?" He shook his head, eyes still on the map. "Maybe, when they tell me to." Her lips curved into the faintest smile. "Still taking orders?" He looked up, meeting her gaze. "Trying not to." A distant horn echoed through the camp, her signal to prepare. She turned toward the door, sunlight touching her face for the first time in months. As she stepped outside, the world smelled of damp soil and diesel. Behind her, the officer watched quietly, knowing goodbye was the only order neither of them could follow properly. The sunlight was thin, watery, uncertain. Like the day itself wasn't sure it should exist. Hannah stepped out into the open yard, her blanket folded tight against her chest. The camp stretched before her. Endless rows of prisoners, mud underfoot, diesel in the air. The men stood in silence, lined up by nationality and number, their eyes hollow from years of waiting for something. Release, revenge, redemption. No one knew which. She joined the line, blending into the mass of khaki and grey. Around her, faces blurred into one another. Soldiers once feared, now reduced to silence and ration tins. Somewhere, a guard shouted an order, but the sound faded quickly, swallowed by the wind. She felt the weight of everything left unsaid pressing against her ribs. Each breath came out heavy. The trucks waited ahead, engines idling, their exhaust curling like smoke from graves. The war was over, but this was its aftertaste. She caught a glimpse of a Soviet transport officer inspecting the crowd, clipboard in hand. Rumors had already spread. Men shipped east, never returning. Later reports would confirm it. 1 in 5 Japanese prisoners who entered Soviet captivity never came home. The rest carried ghosts with them for life. Hannah shivered, clutching the blanket tighter. Around her, the line began to move. Boots squelched through the mud, forming a slow, mechanical rhythm, like a heartbeat made of exhaustion. She looked back once, toward the wooden building at the edge of the yard. The door to the officers' quarters stood open. A figure leaned against the frame. Him, the young lieutenant, sleeves rolled, eyes fixed on her. He didn't wave. He just stood there, watching. Maybe because waving would have made it feel like an ending, and both of them knew this wasn't one. Their eyes met for a single heartbeat before the crowd pushed her forward. The sound of chains rattled as someone tripped ahead. Hannah blinked hard, the sunlight sharp against her eyes. In the space between breaths, she realized, this wasn't a march of prisoners. It was a procession of survivors, carrying ghosts that wouldn't stay buried. She turned her gaze forward again, steps sinking with the others, the blanket slipping slightly in her arms. The trucks waited, engines still growling. Behind her, the officer's figure disappeared into the light. The truck jolted forward, gears grinding as it rolled down the dirt road cutting through the camp's perimeter. Hannah held tight to the wooden plank beneath her, the blanket wrapped around her shoulders. The wind bit through her thin uniform, carrying the bitter scent of fuel and rust. Around her, other prisoners sat silent, eyes vacant, hands clasped, bodies swaying with each bump. No one spoke. Silence had become their language of survival. Hours later, when the truck finally slowed near a checkpoint, the guards ordered them out for inspection. Hannah stepped onto the road, boots sinking into wet gravel. As she straightened her clothes, something shifted against her ribs, a faint crinkle of paper. She froze. Her pockets had been empty when she left the room. Heart thudding, she reached inside and felt it. A small folded note tucked deep in the lining. The handwriting on the outside was careful, unfamiliar, English letters pressed hard into the paper. She unfolded it with trembling fingers. 3 words stared back at her. You will live. The world tilted slightly. She read the words again, mouthing each one slowly, though she didn't fully understand their meaning. Live. That was the one she knew. She repeated it under her breath, tasting it like the first sip of coffee days ago. The officer must have slipped it there before she left, quietly, deliberately, without ceremony. No rank, no signature, no flag, just a message from one survivor to another. Her throat tightened. In a war where letters were censored, rewritten, erased, this one piece of paper felt like rebellion. During those years, Allied command intercepted more than 10,000 prisoner letters each week, editing them into polite fragments of obedience. But this was raw, unsupervised humanity. She folded the note carefully and slipped it back into her pocket. It wasn't just ink and paper. It was proof that someone had seen her not as an enemy, but as a person worth saving. The guard barked an order. She climbed back onto the truck, fingers gripping the paper through the fabric. The road ahead stretched toward Yokohama, toward whatever future waited for people who'd forgotten how to dream. As the truck rumbled forward, she looked up at the sky, grey, infinite, restless, and whispered, "I will." Years later, that note would still rest folded in her hand, edges worn, words barely visible but alive, just like her. Tokyo, 1952. The city had changed, but so had she. The ruins were now skeletons of new buildings, rising out of the ashes like they'd never burned. Neon signs flickered where air raid sirens once screamed. Hana walked down a narrow hospital corridor, her shoes quiet against polished floors. The scent of disinfectant filled the air. Clean, sharp, familiar. She wore a plain white uniform, no badge this time. Her hair was shorter, her posture straighter. And yet, the past followed her like a second shadow. The hospital was American-run, part of the reconstruction effort after the peace treaty signed the previous year. The men in uniforms now carried clipboards instead of rifles. They greeted her politely, calling her Miss Hana, unaware that once she'd been a prisoner among them. She didn't correct them. Some truths were lighter when left untold. She made her rounds quietly, checking temperatures, changing bandages, smiling when needed. Most days were mechanical, but sometimes a flash of movement or a familiar accent would pull her back to that night in the officers' quarters. The coffee, the peaches, the sound of rain, and always the note. She still kept it, folded, fragile, hidden in a small locket around her neck. The paper had faded, edges soft from time, but the words were still there. "You will live." Those 3 words had carried her through hunger, through displacement, through the long, empty years when peace felt colder than war. She didn't know if the officer survived, or if he'd ever made it home. She only knew that in one night, an enemy had handed her something her own nation had forgotten to give: permission to exist beyond obedience. Outside, a siren wailed briefly, not for war this time, but for an ambulance. She looked out the window as it passed, Red Cross gleaming in the sunlight. Her reflection stared back, older, calm, unafraid. She turned and walked back down the hall toward the next room, toward another patient waiting. The world had rebuilt itself piece by piece, on the backs of those who had once destroyed it. War had ended years ago, but its lessons still whispered beneath the city's new skin. Victory fades, mercy remains. She paused at the ward door, fingers brushing the locket once more. "You will live," she whispered again, and this time it wasn't memory, it was truth.